Hello and welcome to our video summarizing all you need to know about the history of Vietnam. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to give you an overview of Vietnam, its historical relationship with China and Cambodia, along with the nature of its government and economy. This video is really useful, especially if you're studying Vietnam as part of your history coursework or exam, as I'll get into the details you need to know to get top marks. So let's get started. So first of all, in 1976, Vietnam was officially unified and renamed Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. The Vietnamese Communist Party dropped its front name, Labour Party, and changed the title of First Secretary, a term used by China, to General Secretary, used by the Soviet Union, with Lead One as General Secretary. The Viet Cong was dissolved. The party emphasized development of heavy industry and collectivization of agriculture. Over the next few years, private enterprises were seized by the government and their owners were often sent to the new economic zones to clear land. So, to be clear, the new economic zones are communist euphemism for a thick jungle. So the farmers were coerced into state-controlled cooperatives. Transportation of food and goods between provinces was deemed illegal except by the government. Within a short period of time, Vietnam was hit with severe shortages of food and basic necessities. The Mekong Delta, once a world-class rice-producing area, was threatened with famine. During the mid-80s, inflation reached triple figures. The CRVN government implemented a Stalinist dictatorship of the proletariat in the south as they had done in the north. The security apparatus network controlled every aspect of people's lives. Censorship was strict and ultra-conservative, with most, pre-1975, works in the fields of music, art, and literature being banned. All religions had to be reorganized into state-controlled churches. Any negative comments towards the party, the government, Uncle Ho, or anything related to communism might earn the person the tag of reactionary, with consequences ranging from being harassed by police, expelled from school or workplace, to being sent to prison. Nevertheless, the communist authorities failed to suppress the black market, where food, consumer goods, and banned literature could be bought at high prices. The security apparatus also failed to stop a nationwide clandestine network of people trying to escape the country. In many cases, the security officers of entire districts were bribed and even got involved in organizing the escape schemes. These living conditions resulted in the exodus of over 1 million Vietnamese people secretly escaping the country, either by sea or overland through Cambodia. For the people fleeing by sea, their wooden boats were often not seaworthy. They were packed with people like sardines and lacked sufficient food and water. Many were caught or shot at by the Vietnamese Coast Guards, and many perished at sea due to the boats sinking, capsizing in storms, starvation, and thirst. While most refugees were resettled to other countries within 5 years, others languished in these camps for over a decade. In the 90s, refugees who could not find asylum were deported back to Vietnam. Communities of Vietnamese refugees arrived in the US, Canada, Australia, France, West Germany, and the UK. The refugees often sent relief packages packed with necessities such as medicines and sanitary goods to their relatives in Vietnam to help them survive. Very few would send money as it would be exchanged far below market rates by the Vietnamese government. So now on to the Cambodia and Chinese conflict. So despite the defeat of South Vietnam, there was no serious demobilization of the Vietnamese People's Army. which remained one of Asia's largest militaries at over 1 million troops, are a sign that warfare was coming to an end anytime soon. Not only were Vietnamese soldiers highly experienced from decades of fighting, but also had acquired a large cache of captured US and South Vietnamese armaments. Vietnam soon found itself drawn into conflict with Cambodia, which had been ruled by the communist Khmer Rouge since 1975. In addition to this, Sino-Vietnamese relations deteriorated quite rapidly following Mao Zedong's death in 1976 due to Hanoi's unremitting loyalty to the Soviet Union, which was at odds with China during the 70s. By 1978, most trade and material assistance programs between the two countries had ceased, and Vietnam forbade Chinese ships from docking at its ports. As the Khmer Rouge were allies of Beijing, this further aggravated tensions, and following border skirmishes, the VPA launched a full-scale armed invasion of Cambodia during the first week of 1979. In Cambodia, the Vietnamese invasion had stopped the genocide of millions of Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge. The pro-Vietnamese People's Republic of Kampuchea was created with Heng Samrin as chairman in January 1979. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge allied with non-communist guerrilla forces led by Norodom Sihanouk and Son Sann to fight against the Vietnamese forces and the new Phnom Penh regime. Some high-ranking officials of the Heng Samrin regime in the early 80s resisted Vietnamese control, resulting in a purge that removed Pan Sovan, Prime Minister and General Secretary of the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party. The war lasted until 1989, when Vietnam withdrew its troops and handed the administration of Cambodia to the United Nations. After more than a century of foreign domination and 21 years of war and division, Vietnam was finally a single, independent nation free from external control and interference. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the revolutionary leader who had died 6 years earlier. North Vietnam's Communist Party, Lao Dong, merged with the People's Revolutionary Party of South Vietnam to form the Communist Party of Vietnam. A new national constitution was adopted, and on July 2, 1976, North and South Vietnam were officially reunified. The new nation was formally called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, a title it retains today. Vietnam's third constitution, based on that of the USSR, was written in 1980. The Communist Party was stated by the Constitution to be the only party to represent the people and to lead the country. In 1980, cosmonaut Pham Thuan became the first Vietnamese and the first Asian to go into space, traveling on the Soviet Soyuz 37 to service the Salyut 6 space station. During the early 80s, a number of overseas Vietnamese organizations were created with the aim of overthrowing the Vietnamese Communist government through armed struggle. Most groups attempted to infiltrate Vietnam, but eventually were eliminated by Vietnamese security and armed forces. Overall, the first decade after reunification was not a happy time for the country. Non-stop warfare consumed large amounts of Vietnam's resources, both financially and by depleting the labor force of young men. The country remained internationally isolated, having little contact with the nation outside COMCON members, and faced with a huge hostile neighbor to the north. In an 1981 interview with American journalist Stanley Corno, Premier Pham Van Dong remarked, "Yes, we defeated the United States, but now we are a poor, undeveloped nation and barely have enough to eat. Hence, the saying that waging war is easy, but running a country is hard." Compounding all this was the complete failure of the 5-year plan adopted in 1976. as Vietnam remained one of the world's poorest countries with a per capita GDP of less than $300 and almost totally dependent on Soviet aid, which reached as much as $3 billion a year by 1982. Moscow faced mounting pressure from its Warsaw Pact allies to reduce outlays to Vietnam. Soviet-Vietnamese relations were also harmed by the former's wishes to have greater involvement in Vietnam's economic development and increased access to military facilities. In 1982, the VCP held its 5th National Congress, in which General Secretary Lee Duan stated that the party wishes sternly to criticize itself and our nation's manifold difficulties, while aggravated by outside circumstances that could not be helped, are nonetheless worsened by the various errors and shortcomings of officials. Lee also expressed his dismay at the average age of the party leadership, noting that there was only one person on the Central Committee under 60. The US and its allies refused to trade with Hanoi, in part because of disputes over missing American servicemen Washington claimed were still imprisoned in Vietnam. By 1979, civilians in Vietnamese cities were subject to food rationing. Most received a paltry 2 kilograms of rice and 200 grams of meat each per month. The task of forging this new nation generated excitement among leaders of the CPV, but there were a number of problems and obstacles they had to overcome. The CPV's long-term plan was to mold the newly reunified Vietnam into a socialist state in the image of North Vietnam. The most significant barrier to this was political opposition. The current government and its American backers had left Vietnam, but they left behind millions of supporters, including former military personnel, bureaucrats, business owners, and civilians. These loyalists had been subjected to American propaganda, which suggested the communists would slaughter every one of them. This threat never eventuated. However, the CPV wanted to neutralize the risk posed by loyalists and other political opponents. If these dissidents remained, they might flourish and grow into counter-revolutionary insurgency. According to historian Van Con and Nguyen, the CPV's economic program could be summarized in 3 points. The first was the eradication of private commerce and trade, what the party called capitalist merchants and compradors, and their replacement by state institutions established from scratch. The second was the nationalization of industry, including French-owned coal mines and other foreign corporations in Vietnam. The third was land reform, the abolition of private ownership, the end of exploitation by landowners, and the reorganization of agricultural production along collective principles. Vietnam was granted membership of the United Nations in 1977. However, for the first decade of its life, it was shunned by most Western nations. China cut all aid to Vietnam in 1978, but Hanoi retained close ties with the Soviet Union. The CPV relaxed its economic grip on Vietnam in the mid-80s, allowing the operation of small factories, businesses, and service industries for profits. These reforms, broadly called renovation, allowed for new development, an increase in growth, and an improvement in living standards. They were not accompanied by political reforms, with Vietnam remaining a staunch one-party socialist state. Since 1986, Vietnam has progressed in a similar fashion to China, its economic policies becoming increasingly capitalist and market-oriented, though tempered by socialist controls. In 89, Hanoi withdrew its troops from Cambodia, which allowed it to re-enter the international fold. Since then, Vietnam has sought and received foreign aid, as well as becoming a member state of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Acceptance. Internationally, Vietnam retained close ties with the Soviet Union, but was shunned by most Western nations. This continued until economic reforms and liberalization in the late 80s. During the late 80s, Vietnam began tentative market reforms along the model then being adopted by China. The basis for these experiments were in the South, which had a stronger tradition of trade and commerce. The perestroika policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev were also a source of motivation. Although communist governments in Eastern Europe were collapsing in 89, Vietnam was kept comparatively isolated from these events due to its poverty and geographical distance, and a few small pro-democracy protests in Hanoi were quickly suppressed. The fall of the Soviet Union in 91 caused a thaw in the long hostile Sino-Vietnamese relations, as the two nations embraced each other as some of the only surviving communist states. So that's all for the history of Vietnam. If you found this video useful, give it a thumbs up, and do subscribe to our channel, where we offer materials that you can use as part of your studies to really get a better grasp of specific areas you might find challenging. Make sure to visit our website, where you'll find revision guides, model answers, and tools to get top marks. Thank you for listening!